Sit in the back. Do not speak unless spoken to. My mother, Selene, delivered the command without warmth, her eyes never leaving my sister. In the cramped space of the carriage, I was nothing more than an inconvenience she was forced to bring along. While Stella sat bathed in the glow of the carriage lamps, her golden hair catching the light like spun honey and her neck heavy with royal jewels, I was shoved into the shadows. My mother adjusted Stella's silk gown one last time, whispering for her to be charming and demure to catch the eye of the Alpha King. When her gaze finally slid to me, it was brief and dismissive. I recited my role like a well-worn prayer. Sit in the back. Do not draw attention. At 22 years old, I had spent my entire life as the spare, the bronze shadow to Stella's sunlight. Tonight was the Ashford Pack's royal ball, and as the carriage pulled toward the blazing torches of the estate, I prepared to disappear once again. The Ashford estate was a masterpiece of intimidation and opulence, a sprawling fortress of stone and fire that served as the beating heart of the Shadow Realm. As our carriage passed through the iron gates, the air grew thick with the scent of pine, wood smoke, and the overwhelming pheromones of hundreds of high-ranking wolves. Torches blazed along the perimeter, their orange tongues licking at the dark sky, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mimic my own desire to vanish. Music spilled from the open doors, a frantic, rhythmic pulse that signaled the start of the most important social event of the season. Inside, the ballroom was a sea of shimmering silks and predatory grace. My mother, Selene, swept forward with Stella, her hand proprietary on my sister's arm as she steered her toward the center of the room where the light was brightest. I did as I was trained. I drifted to the periphery, finding a seat partially hidden behind a massive marble column. From this vantage point, I was a ghost in a simple dress, watching the elite of the Ashford Pack perform their elaborate mating dances. I watched alphas compete for Stella's attention, their smiles as sharp as their claws, while my mother beamed with a cold, calculating satisfaction. Then the music stopped. The crowd parted like a tide retreating before a storm, and he entered. Alpha King Cassian did not walk. He commanded the space he occupied. He was tall and broad-shouldered, carrying a physical presence that suggested immense power held under agonizingly thin restraint. His dark hair and sharp, intense features were not handsome in the way of the preening alphas on the floor. His face was a landscape of harsh angles and unreadable intent. As he scanned the room, I realized Cassian was a man who did not suffer fools. He looked like a ruler who saw through the veneer of jewels and practiced laughter, someone who demanded honesty in a world built entirely on lies. My mother moved instantly, positioning Stella directly in his line of sight, but the Alpha King's eyes did not linger on the golden bait. His gaze moved past the eager Omegas and the ambitious Alphas, cutting through the pretense of the ballroom until it landed squarely on me, hidden in the shadows of my column. In that moment, the air in my lungs turned to ice, for I realized that the one man I was supposed to hide from was the only one who truly saw me. I retreated further into the gloom, the cold stone of the pillar pressing against my spine. In my hands, I clutched a leather-bound volume I had pilfered from the back of the Royal Library, a dense, forbidden treatise on the third principle of pack governance. It was a dangerous choice for a ballroom, but the words were the only thing that kept the hollow ache of being unnecessary from consuming me. While the air in the center of the room was thick with the scent of expensive perfumes and desperate ambition, the shadows felt honest. I kept my head down, pretending to be absorbed in a passage about the consent of the governed, convinced that my plain bronze dress and silent corner made me invisible. But the heavy, rhythmic thrum of boots against the polished floor stopped directly in front of my hiding spot. The scent of rain, cedar, and something ancient and predatory filled my senses. Authority is not a right granted by blood, but a responsibility maintained through the prosperity of the pack. A deep, melodic voice read aloud, finishing the sentence I had just been staring at. My heart leaped into my throat as I looked up. Alpha King Cassian stood there, his massive frame blocking out the light of the chandeliers. He wasn't looking at my sister, who was currently performing a practice laugh for a group of minor alphas across the floor.
He was looking at me.
His eyes were dark, like the depths of a forest at midnight, and they held a terrifying level of clarity. "The third principle," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in my chest. "A bold choice for a girl who is told to sit quietly in the back." I didn't think anyone would notice, Your Majesty," I whispered, my fingers trembling against the spine of the book. Cassian leaned one hand against the marble column, effectively trapping me in our small, private world of shadows. The corner of his mouth quirked into something that wasn't quite a smile. It was more of a challenge. "I have spent the last hour watching dozens of people perform for me. They offer me rehearsed smiles, curated lineages, and empty flattery. And then I find a girl hiding in the dark with a book that most of my council members haven't even had the courage to finish." He stepped closer, the heat radiating from him making the cool air of the ballroom feel suddenly stifling. He reached out, his long fingers gently brushing the cover of the book before his gaze locked back onto mine. "Tell me, Nova," he said, and the way he spoke my name felt like a claim. "Why is the Thornfield pack hiding the intelligent daughter behind a pillar? Are they afraid I prefer a trophy over a mind? Or are they simply afraid of what you might say if you were allowed to speak?" I opened my mouth to offer the practiced excuse, that I was just the spare, the backup, the one who didn't matter, but the look in his eyes stopped the lie before it could form. He wasn't asking out of politeness. He was calling me out. He was stripping away the shadow I had used as armor for 22 years, and for the first time in my life, I felt the terrifying thrill of being truly seen. The silence that followed his words was more deafening than the roar of the music had been. Cassian didn't wait for my permission. He simply reached down and took the book from my hands, closing it with a finality that signaled the end of my life as an observer. His hand, large and calloused, wrapped around my wrist. It wasn't a cruel grip, but it was absolute, the weight of an Alpha King who is finished with games. "Walk with me, Nova," he commanded. He led me out from behind the safety of the marble pillar, dragging me into the brilliant, unforgiving light of the chandeliers. I felt the collective gasp of the room before I heard it. The rhythmic swirl of the dancers began to falter as we approached the center of the floor. I could see my mother, Selene, standing near the refreshment table, her wine glass frozen halfway to her lips. Beside her, Stella's perfect porcelain mask cracked, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and burgeoning horror. They had spent hours preparing Stella to be the center of this room, yet here was the king, leading the shadow, daughter into the heart of the light. When we reached the very center of the ballroom, Cassian stopped and turned to face me. He raised a hand, and with a single, sharp gesture, the orchestra fell silent. The sudden absence of sound was terrifying. Hundreds of eyes, predatory, judgmental, and shocked, burned into my skin. I wanted to bolt, to find the dark corners where I belonged, but Cassian's hand moved to my waist, anchoring me. "Your Majesty," I whispered, my voice trembling so hard it was barely audible. "Please. Everyone is looking. I'm not supposed to be here." "You are exactly where you are supposed to be," he replied, his voice carrying through the silent hall like a low roll of thunder. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't acknowledge the shocked gasps or the whispered scandals already forming on the lips of the high-ranking alphas. He kept his focus entirely on me. They're looking because they have never seen anything real in this room until now. He bowed then, a deep, formal gesture of respect that a king usually reserved for royalty of equal standing. "Dance with me, Nova of Thornfield." It wasn't a request. It was a declaration of war against the social order my mother had spent my entire life building. As he took my hand and placed it on his shoulder, the orchestra began a slow, haunting waltz. He swept me into the first turn, and for a moment, the world blurred. The faces of the envious and the confused faded into a smear of color, leaving only the steady, grounding presence of the man holding me. I was no longer the spare or the shadow. In the center of the Ashford ballroom, under the watchful eyes of the entire shadow realm, the forgotten daughter was being led through the dance by the king himself, and the silence of the room told me that nothing would ever be the same again. The heat of Cassian's hand through the thin fabric of my dress was a grounding force against the suffocating weight of 1,000 stairs. Around us, the waltz continued, but the other couples kept a wide, respectful radius, as if we were the eye of a hurricane. I kept my gaze fixed on the silver embroidery of his tunic, afraid that if I looked up, the sheer audacity of this moment would shatter me. "You dance like someone who spent a lot of time watching from the corners," Cassian said, his voice dropping to a register meant only for me. "You've memorized every step, yet you move as if you're trying not to leave a footprint." I was taught that the best version of myself is the one that doesn't displace the air around me, I replied, the honesty of his presence pulling the truth from my lips before I could censor it. "My sister is the sun, your majesty. One doesn't try to compete with the light." "And yet, you spend your time reading about the third principle," he countered, his lead becoming more assertive as he spun me toward the far end of the floor. "A theory that suggests a ruler's strength is nothing without the informed consent of the pack. Most alphas in this room find that idea offensive. They believe strength is a birthright, a cudgel to be used until everyone falls in line. Strength without merit is just a slow-acting poison," I said, finally finding the courage to meet his eyes. The intensity there was terrifying, but it wasn't the cold judgment I was used to from my mother. It was curiosity. If a king rules through fear, he isn't a leader, he's a jailer. True authority comes from the realization that the smallest omega in the pack has a stake in the alpha's decisions. Merit should dictate the seat at the table, not just the blood in one's veins. Cassian's grip tightened slightly, not in aggression, but in a sharp intake of focus. "You're suggesting that the hierarchy I sit upon is flawed. That a spare daughter with a hidden book might understand the shadow realm better than the high alphas who advise me. I'm suggesting that those who live in the shadows see the cracks in the foundation much more clearly than those who are blinded by the glare of the throne," I said, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. We moved in a seamless circle, the music swelling as we reached the climax of the waltz. Cassian studied me, his gaze tracing the lines of my face with a depth that felt like he was reading my very soul. There was a shift in his expression, the look of a man who had been searching for a specific key and had finally heard it click into the lock. "They told you to sit in the back because they knew that if you ever spoke, you would make them all look obsolete," he whispered. "You don't have the soul of a backup Nova. You have the mind of a sovereign." The dance ended, the final note of the violin hanging in the air like a bared blade. Cassian didn't release my hand immediately. He stood there, tall and unyielding in the center of the room, looking at me not as a curiosity or a temporary distraction, but as a peer. I could feel my mother's fury radiating from the sidelines, a physical heat that promised a reckoning, but for the first time, the fear didn't paralyze me. The Alpha King had seen the ruler hiding beneath the bronze silk, and I realized I could never go back to being just a shadow. The music transitioned into something light and meaningless, but the air in the ballroom remained charged, a physical weight pressing against my chest. As Alpha King Cassian bowed and stepped away to greet a contingent of high alphas, the protective circle he had inadvertently cast around me vanished. I stood alone in the center of the floor, a bronze speck in a room of gold, feeling the sudden, chilling shift in the atmosphere. The whispers began instantly, sharp, jagged sounds that cut through the air like glass. I didn't have to look for my mother. The scent of bitter almond and ozone preceded her. Selene moved through the crowd with the grace of a predator closing in on wounded prey. Stella followed behind her, her face a mask of tear-streaked fury and humiliation. Before I could even draw a breath to explain, my mother was in front of me. Her eyes were not the eyes of a parent. They were cold, reptilian slits of pure, unadulterated rage. "You miserable, selfish little leech," she hissed, her voice a low, vibrating tremor. I tried to speak, to tell her that I hadn't asked for the king's attention, that I had stayed behind the column exactly as instructed. "Mother, The blow was so sudden and so violent that my head snapped to the side. The sound of her hand connecting with my cheek echoed like a pistol shot against the high vaulted ceilings. The ballroom went deathly silent. My skin erupted in a searing, throbbing heat, and I tasted the metallic tang of blood where my teeth had cut into the inside of my lip. I stumbled, my hand flying to my face, but she stepped closer, invading my space until I could smell the expensive wine on her breath. "You are told to stay in the back," she snarled, loud enough now for the surrounding nobles to hear every word. "You are told to let your sister shine. Instead, you used your pathetic, manipulative tricks to embarrass this family in front of the king. Did you think a dance made you special? Did you think a few words about books made you a queen?" She reached out, her fingers digging into the flesh of my upper arm with bruising force, shaking me. "Look at yourself, Nova. You are a spare, a shadow. You are nothing but the dirt beneath Stella's boots, and you will never, ever be more than an inconvenience to this pack. You have ruined your sister's night, and you have humiliated me. You are nothing." I looked around the room, my vision blurred by unshed tears. I saw the mocking smiles of the other Omegas and the indifferent stares of the Alphas. Stella stood by, her arms crossed, watching my public dismantling with a cold, satisfied glint in her eyes. The shame was a physical weight, heavier than the slap, dragging me back down into the dirt where they believed I belonged. I had dared to step into the light for 10 minutes, and this was the price. I was the girl in the bronze dress, bleeding on the ballroom floor, reminded once again that in the house of Thornfield, my only value was my invisibility. And now, even that was gone. The stinging heat on my cheek was nothing compared to the cold vacuum of the room as my mother's fingers clamped onto my arm like iron shackles. She began to haul me toward the exit, her eyes fixed forward, already crafting the lies she would tell to explain away my hysteria. I stumbled, my vision blurred, ready to accept the darkness of the carriage and the inevitable locked door that awaited me at the estate. "Release her." The voice didn't just cut through the whispers. It silenced the very air. It was a low, dangerous vibration that seemed to emanate from the stones of the floor itself.
Luna Selene froze.
Her grip on my arm tightened for a frantic second before she realized who had spoken. Alpha King Cassian was no longer the intrigued dance partner. He was the sovereign of the Shadow Realm, and the aura of power radiating from him was so immense that the nobles nearest to him instinctively took a step back. He walked toward us, his boots striking the marble with the steady rhythm of a heartbeat. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't even look at me. His eyes were locked on my mother with a predatory stillness that made her breath hitch. "Your Majesty," my mother stammered, her voice losing its sharp edge and dissolving into a high-pitched flutter. "I apologize for my daughter's behavior. She is unwell. I am taking her home to ensure she doesn't further disrupt your evening." "I did not ask for an explanation, Luna Selene. I gave a command," Cassian said. He stopped mere inches from us, his shadow looming over my mother's trembling frame. "You will take your hand off her.
Now."
My mother's fingers uncurled, as if they had been burned. I swayed, the sudden release of tension making my knees weak, but I didn't fall. Cassian stepped into the space between us, his massive frame acting as a shield, a wall of cedar and storm-scented heat that finally blocked my mother from my sight. He turned to me then. His expression softened, though the fire in his eyes remained. He reached out, his thumb grazing the corner of my jaw just below where the skin was beginning to bloom into a deep purple bruise. The touch was impossibly gentle, a stark contrast to the violence of the woman standing behind him. "You said earlier that authority is a responsibility," Cassian said, his voice loud enough to carry to every corner of the ballroom. "It seems some in this room have forgotten that responsibility includes the protection of those within their own house." He turned back to my mother, his face hardening into an expression of royal finality. "Nova is no longer under your jurisdiction for the remainder of this visit. I find her insights on the third principle far more compelling than the hollow theatrics of this ballroom. Since you find her presence such an inconvenience, I shall relieve you of it." The room remained deathly still as he delivered the killing blow to my mother's social ambitions. "Nova, you will join me for a private breakfast at the Ashford residence tomorrow morning. My carriage will arrive at dawn. Ensure she is ready, Luna Selene. I would hate for a royal summons to be treated with the same disregard you show your own blood." He didn't wait for a response. With one last look at me, a look that promised this was only the beginning, the Alpha King turned and walked away, leaving my mother standing in the ruins of her reputation and me standing, for the first time, in the light. The iron key turned in the lock with a finality that echoed through the cold stones of my bedroom. My mother's face, usually a mask of practiced composure, was contorted into something unrecognizable as she stared at me through the narrowing gap of the door. The mark of her hand was still a burning brand on my cheek, but the fire in her eyes was far more dangerous. She didn't scream. She spoke with a quiet, jagged precision that made my blood run cold. She told me that no carriage would be coming for me at dawn, that the Alpha King would be told I had fallen ill with a shameful, contagious fever, and that by the time I was allowed out of this room, Cassian would have forgotten the shadow girl ever existed. The door slammed shut, and the heavy thud of the bolt sliding home signaled the start of my erasure. I sat on the edge of my bed, the darkness of the room pressing in on me. I had glimpsed the light of the Ashford throne, felt the heat of a king who valued my mind, and now I was being buried alive in the silence I had spent 22 years perfecting. The moon climbed high, casting silver bars across the floor, and I realized with a crushing weight that my mother was right. Without a way to reach the Ashford gates, I would remain an inconvenience, a ghost in the halls of Thornfield. Hours bled into one another until a faint, metallic scratching sounded from the other side of the oak panels. I froze, thinking it was a guard or my mother returning to deliver more venom. But then came the soft click of the mechanism yielding. The door creaked open just an inch, and the scent of jasmine and honey drifted in. Stella stood in the hallway, her golden hair disheveled and her silk ball gown replaced by a dark traveling cloak. In her hand, she held a set of silver hairpins, her fingers trembling. She didn't say a word as she beckoned me forward, her eyes wide with a frantic, desperate loyalty I hadn't expected. I hesitated, looking at the sister who had always been the sun to my shadow, the one whose brilliance had always required my darkness. "Go," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the corridor. "She thinks she is protecting our future, Nova, but I saw how he looked at you. I saw how you looked at him. I don't want to be the sun, if it means you have to stay in the dark. I've spent my life being the perfect trophy, and for once, I want to be a sister." She shoved a small satchel into my hands. My book on governance was tucked inside, saved from the ballroom floor. Stella led me through the servant passages. Navigating the house, she had been groomed to rule with a quiet, subversive grace. When we reached the kitchen gardens, the cool night air hit my face like a blessing. She pointed toward the tree line where a single horse stood waiting. "The king's carriage will be blocked at the main gate by Mother's guards," Stella said, looking back at the darkened windows of the estate. "But he told you to be ready. So go. Be the ruler he thinks you are." I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized that for the first time, we weren't sunlight and shadow. We were just two sisters, breaking the chains of a legacy that had tried to keep us both in cages. I didn't look back as I disappeared into the trees, riding toward the dawn, and the king who was waiting for the woman beneath the bronze silk. The morning sun was a pale, silver sliver climbing over the jagged peaks of the Ashford estate as I was ushered into the private solar. The room was a sanctuary of dark wood and the smell of old parchment, a stark contrast to the hollow glitter of the ballroom. Alpha King Cassian sat at a small circular table near the window, his crown absent and his tunic collar open, looking less like a distant deity and more like a man burdened by the weight of a world he was trying to fix. He didn't stand as I entered. He simply gestured to the seat across from him. On the table sat a modest spread of bread, fruit, and the book he had taken from me the night before. I sat, my hands folded in my lap, feeling the heavy silence of the room. The bruise on my cheek had deepened to a dark violet, a mark I expected him to pity or ignore. "Eat, Nova," he said, his voice softer than the thunder it had been the night before. "I did not summon you here to starve you, or to watch you perform the role of the silent Omega." "Why did you summon me, Your Majesty?" I asked, my voice finding a steadiness I didn't know I possessed. "My mother is likely already spreading word of my illness. To the rest of the pack, I am a shadow that overstepped its bounds. To you, I should be nothing more than a curiosity." Cassian set down his tea and looked at me, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical weight. I spent last night surrounded by people who have spent their lives perfecting the art of being what they think I want. They offer me submissiveness, beauty, and silence. They are trophies, Nova. And a kingdom cannot be built on trophies. He reached across the table, his fingers tapping the cover of my book. I found a woman hiding in the dark who understands that authority is a debt, not a gift. I found someone who has been overlooked so long she has learned to see the truth. I don't want a Luna who sits 3 steps behind me, nodding at my every word while the foundation of this realm cracks. I want a wife who challenges me. I want a partner who grows with me, who argues the third principle at dawn and holds the line beside me at dusk. I felt the air leave my lungs. You are talking about a queen, not a mate. I am talking about both, he countered, leaning forward. The heat of his presence was a promise, not a threat. I am tired of performances. I am tired of the gold that hides the rot. I am offering you a seat at the head of the council table and a place in my life where you will never, ever have to apologize for being the most intelligent person in the room. He didn't reach for my hand. He offered me the book instead, a silent acknowledgement of my mind. I am not asking you to be Stella. I am asking you to be Nova. Will you rule the Shadow Realm with me, or will you go back to the shadows? I looked at the book, then at the man who saw the ruler beneath the bronze silk. I realized then that the spare daughter was gone. In her place was a woman who was finally ready to stop disappearing. I reached out and took the book, my fingers brushing his, and gave him the only honest answer I had. I have spent 22 years sitting in the back, Cassian. I think I'm ready to see the view from the front. The high-backed chair at the head of the royal council table was carved from ancient obsidian, cool and unyielding against my spine. 6 months ago, I had been a shadow clinging to the marble pillars of a ballroom, hoping only to remain unnoticed. Today, the sunlight of the shadow realm streamed through the tall arched windows of the Ashford citadel, illuminating the stack of legislative proposals laid out before me. I didn't hide my books anymore. I wrote them into law. Around the long table, high alphas who had once looked past me with indifferent eyes now waited in a heavy, expectant silence. They watched as my quill moved across the parchment, marking the margins of a proposal regarding the redistribution of resources to the Outer Pact territories. I could feel my mother's ghost in the back of my mind, whispering about the impropriety of a woman, an Omega, occupying a seat of such absolute authority. But that voice was drowned out by the steady, rhythmic scratch of my nib and the grounding presence of the man sitting to my right. Cassian looked up from his own map of the borderlands, his dark eyes catching mine. There was no crown on his head in these private working sessions, yet he had never looked more like a king. He didn't look at me with the indulgent gaze of a man humoring a hobby. He looked at me with the sharp, professional respect of a ruler checking in with his most trusted strategist. The territorial alphas are concerned about the shift in hierarchy, Nova, Cassian said, his voice a low rumble that settled the restless energy in the room. What is your assessment of the third principle's application here? I met his gaze, my posture straight, and my voice clear. The concern is rooted in a fear of merit over blood, Your Majesty. But as we discussed, a pack is only as strong as its most vulnerable members' investment in the Alpha's vision. If we bypass the consent of the outer territories, we aren't building a kingdom. We're maintaining a cage. A murmur of debate broke out among the counselors, but Cassian silenced it with a single, raised hand. He leaned back, a small, private smile touching the corner of his mouth, the look of a man who had gambled on a spare daughter and won the greatest prize in the realm. I believe the Queen has identified the flaw in your logic, gentlemen, he stated firmly. Revise the proposal to reflect her notes. As the council adjourned and the alphas filed out, bowing to us both, Cassian reached over and covered my hand with his. His thumb traced the line of my knuckles, his touch a warm, familiar anchor. I looked around the room, at the maps, the scrolls, and the heavy obsidian table where my voice now carried the weight of the law. I was no longer the bronze shadow kept in the corner to make my sister shine. I was the architect of a new era. I looked at Cassian, the man who had seen through the performance of 1,000 golden omegas to find the honest girl in the dark, and I realized that my sister's sunlight was nothing compared to the power of being truly seen. I was no longer sitting in the back. I was exactly where I was meant to be, ruling the light beside my king.